Far beneath the limestone hills of northern Spain, beyond the reach of weather and daylight, a narrow shaft falls into a chamber filled with the dead. The descent is difficult even with modern ropes, lamps, helmets, and carefully placed platforms. 430,000 years ago, there were no electric lights to reveal the polished walls, no metal ladders, and no map of the passages twisting through the Sierra de Atapuerca. Yet deep inside this cave system, in a place now called Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, the remains of an ancient human population accumulated in extraordinary numbers. More than 7,000 human fossil fragments have been recovered here, representing at least 29 individuals. They are not 29 complete skeletons laid neatly in rows. They are scattered bones, broken skulls, teeth, jaws, ribs, vertebrae, and limb fragments, mixed through sediment in a chamber that seems almost designed to resist explanation. The mystery begins with the route itself. To reach the pit today, researchers enter through Cueva Maya, one part of the immense Atapuerca cave network. They move through passages where stone presses close around the body, then continue toward a vertical drop known as the Sima shaft. At its base lies a small chamber, humid and silent, roughly 13 meters below the approach passage. It is not a comfortable shelter, an obvious campsite, or a place where a community could have lived. No sunlight reaches it. The space is deep within the hill, separated from the surface by a journey that would have been dangerous in darkness. And still, this is where the bones of so many people survived together. Their age places them in one of the most difficult chapters of human evolution. Around 430,000 years ago, Europe is neither the world of modern humans nor yet the familiar late Ice Age landscape of classic Neanderthals. It belongs to the Middle Pleistocene, a long interval of repeated climatic change in which glaciers advance, forests retreat, grasslands spread, and animal communities repeatedly rearrange themselves. Human populations inhabit this shifting continent, but their identities are hard to name. Fossils are rare, scattered, and often incomplete. The people in the pit possess features that anticipate Neanderthals, yet they lived long before the most recognizable Neanderthal anatomy became established. Their bones preserve a population near the roots of that lineage, close enough to seem familiar and distant enough to unsettle any simple family tree. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story waiting below Atapuerca is not merely about what these people looked like. It is about how an astonishing concentration of human remains entered a chamber where almost no ordinary activity appears to have taken place, and why one object among those remains continues to encourage a possibility that cannot yet be proved. The pit contains animal fossils as well, especially the remains of carnivores, including bears that may have fallen or wandered into parts of the cave. But the human accumulation is different in scale and character. The assemblage includes people of varied ages and both sexes. Although precise demographic reconstruction remains difficult, many parts of their bodies are represented. This is not simply a collection of isolated teeth washed from a distant occupation surface. Nor does the chamber resemble a den where predators repeatedly carried in human prey. Researchers have spent decades studying fractures, skeletal representation, sediment, water movement, carnivore damage, and the geometry of the cave, testing every plausible route by which the remains might have arrived. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. Geological processes altered the chamber after the bones entered it. Sediment shifted, bones broke, some fragments moved, while minerals changed their surfaces during an immense period underground. The present cave cannot be assumed to match its ancient form exactly. Entrances may have opened, narrowed, or vanished. Even so, the deepest puzzle remains stubborn. Natural forces can explain part of what happened after deposition, but they do not easily explain why so many human bodies were concentrated there in the first place. One clue lies among them a finely made handaxe of red quartzite, nicknamed Excalibur by the excavation team. Its colour is striking, its workmanship careful, and it is the only stone tool recovered from the human fossil deposit. Perhaps it entered accidentally. Perhaps it was lost during some practical act now impossible to reconstruct. Or perhaps it was placed with the dead, an interpretation that would make it an exceptionally early sign of symbolic behaviour. The evidence remains incomplete. One handaxe cannot establish a funeral rite, and the chamber should not be described confidently as a cemetery. Yet its solitary presence makes coincidence feel less comfortable than it otherwise might. The human remains deepen the unease. One skull, known as cranium 17, bears 2 closely spaced fractures in the forehead. Detailed analysis suggests that both injuries were caused by separate blows from the same object and occurred around the time of death. The pattern is difficult to explain as an accidental fall down the shaft. It is evidence of lethal interpersonal violence, one of the earliest persuasive cases known. But it is not evidence that everyone in the pit was killed, and certainly not proof of a massacre. The violent death of one individual and the collective history of the entire deposit must remain separate questions. That distinction matters because the pit invites imagination faster than the evidence permits certainty. It is easy to picture torches moving through the cave, bodies carried deliberately into darkness, and a red handaxe offered in farewell. Such an image may even prove close to the truth. Yet no torch survives, no spoken intention can be recovered, and no repeated collection of grave goods confirms a ritual. What survives in the record suggests that human agency may have played a role in forming the accumulation, but scholars still debate exactly what kind. Deliberate disposal of bodies does not automatically mean ceremony, grief expressed through objects, or belief in an existence beyond death. For now, the chamber holds its silence. Water gathers on stone. Excavators work within a confined space, removing sediment slowly enough to preserve the position of fragments that may reconnect after hundreds of millennia. Each tooth or splinter of bone can alter the minimum number of individuals, reveal a healed injury, preserve a genetic sequence, or clarify how the deposit formed. Above them, the Atapuerca hills appear modest, their grass and low vegetation giving little hint of the archive sealed inside. Below, thousands of fragments wait in darkness, preserving not one dramatic instant but a complicated chain of lives, deaths, geological changes, and discoveries. The way into the mystery is narrow. The questions opening at its bottom are immense. The darkness at the bottom of the shaft did not surrender its significance all at once. Long before Sima de los Huesos became one of the most closely studied human fossil sites on Earth, the caves of Atapuerca were known locally as openings in a limestone ridge, places entered by generations whose visits left marks, stories, and disturbances. The wider system contains passages used at different times by animals and people, but the remote bone chamber offered no obvious monument at the surface. Its riches were hidden behind a difficult underground route, and when visitors first reached it, they did not arrive with the methods of modern archaeology. By the time scientists understood what lay there, part of the deposit had already been altered by searching hands. The Sierra de Atapuerca rises east of Burgos beside a natural corridor linking the Ebro Basin with the interior of the Iberian Peninsula. Its caves developed as water dissolved the limestone, opening galleries that later filled, drained, and collapsed. Nearby communities knew parts of this subterranean landscape for centuries, while collectors entered for bear fossils and other curiosities. The name Pit of Bones sounded descriptive, but concealed the crucial fact that some remains belonged to distant members of the human family. During the 20th century, access to the Atapuerca caves expanded, sometimes with damaging consequences. Visitors removed fossils without recording their positions. Sediment was disturbed, and material from the upper levels of the deposit was displaced. One particularly destructive trench, dug by people searching for bear teeth and fossils, later complicated the excavation history. Archaeology depends not only on objects but on context, the precise layer, orientation, neighbouring fragments, and geological relationships surrounding each find. A bone pulled from the ground as a souvenir may still be identifiable, but much of the story attached to it disappears. At Sima, researchers would eventually have to distinguish intact deposits from disturbed sediment and reconstruct events that included both Pleistocene processes and modern interference. Scientific attention sharpened in the 1970s when members of the Edelweiss Speleological Group assisted researchers working in the cave system. In 1976, Trinidad Torres, then investigating fossil bears for his doctoral research, organized work in the pit. Among the immense quantity of bear remains, human fossils emerged. A human jaw fragment and other pieces made clear that the chamber contained something far more unusual than a paleontological accumulation of cave bears. Emiliano Aguirre, a leading Spanish paleoanthropologist, recognized the importance of Atapuerca and directed a broad research project beginning in 1978. The ridge was becoming not a single site, but a complex archive of European prehistory whose different caves preserved evidence from widely separated periods. Work in the Sima demanded awkward movement, limited space, and removal of disturbed material before controlled excavation could reach secure deposits. Researchers brought equipment through narrow passages and protected fragile fossils in a damp environment. Even today, only a small team can work below, and every fragment must travel through the same constricted route. Underground discovery brings mud, fatigue, and the knowledge that a careless movement can damage evidence older than the human species itself. In the early 1980s, excavation began to reveal how extensive the human collection might be. Then, in 1984, two remarkably complete human skulls were recovered, later catalogued as Cranium 4 and Cranium 5. Cranium 5, popularly called Miguelón, became especially famous because so much of its face survived. It offered a direct encounter with an individual from the Middle Pleistocene, not merely an isolated brow ridge or tooth. Its heavy facial architecture and damaged teeth would later support detailed studies of anatomy and health. More immediately, the skulls demonstrated that Sima could preserve unusually complete human remains. A chamber once treated largely as a source of bear fossils had become central to the study of human evolution in Europe. The scale continued to grow season after season. Fragments recovered years apart could sometimes be refitted, joining pieces of skulls and long bones separated within the sediment. New jaws, teeth, vertebrae, ribs, hand bones, foot bones, and delicate parts of the ear expanded the anatomical record. Many fossil sites preserve only selected portions of one or a few individuals. Sima offered representation across much of the skeleton and across a population. That difference matters. A single skull can illuminate shape, but dozens of individuals make it possible to examine variation, development, body size, injury, and which features were consistently shared. The pit was gradually changing from a spectacular discovery into something rarer. A population-level window opened hundreds of thousands of years into the past. Leadership also passed to a new generation. The Atapuerca research program came to be directed by Juan Luis Arzuaga, José María Bermúdez de Castro, and Eudald Carbonell, supported by a large interdisciplinary team: excavators, geologists, dating specialists, geneticists, paleontologists, taphonomists, and imaging experts approached the same deposit from different angles. Their conclusions did not always arrive together or remain unchanged. Early classifications assigned the fossils to Homo heidelbergensis, a name widely used for Middle Pleistocene humans but applied inconsistently across regions. As anatomy, chronology, and DNA evidence improved, the Sima population looked increasingly like an early member of the Neanderthal lineage, rather than a convenient example of a broad, uniform species spread across the Old World. Recognition brought international attention after major descriptions in the 1990s and UNESCO World Heritage designation in 2000. Yet excavation remains slow because the deposit is finite, and future methods may recover information present techniques miss. Fossils are scanned, sampled sparingly, and reconsidered decades later. Protein evidence, ancient DNA, imaging, and refined dating were barely imaginable when the first discoveries were made, but preserved material later allowed each approach to ask new questions. That history explains why Sima de los Huesos was not one discovery made on one dramatic day. It was a recognition assembled over decades' local knowledge of a bone-filled pit, collecting, a bear researcher noticing human remains, an excavation reaching intact sediment, and specialists understanding the biological scale of the assemblage. Even the number of individuals has changed as new material and better analyses have accumulated. Current evidence indicates at least 29, not a final census of everyone who entered the chamber. Still, what was nearly overlooked became an archive. Its importance rests not simply on the quantity of bone, but on the combination of abundance, preservation, age, and shared context. The people represented below Atapuerca lived within a relatively narrow span compared with fossils scattered across an entire continent and hundreds of millennia. Their remains allow researchers to ask how one ancient population varied from person to person, and how traits associated with later Neanderthals were taking shape. Before those questions can be trusted, however, the chamber itself must be reconstructed: its sediments, vanished entrances, falling bodies, moving water, bears, and the long geological machinery that turned death into evidence. To understand the human bones, the chamber must first be treated not as a stage but as a geological machine. The Sima de los Huesos seen today is the surviving result of water, gravity, collapse, mineral growth, sediment movement, and more than 400 millennia of change. Its present shape is not a perfect map of the place into which the bodies originally entered. Passages can widen as limestone dissolves, narrow as calcite forms, or disappear behind fallen rock. A route open in the Middle Pleistocene may now be sealed, while a modern opening may expose surfaces that were once inaccessible. Every explanation for the deposit therefore begins with the difficult reconstruction of a cave that no longer exists in quite the same form. The chamber lies at the end of a complicated interior route within Cueva Maya. Near it, a vertical conduit drops from an upper passage into the fossil-bearing area. The human remains occur mainly in deposits conventionally divided into sedimentary units, alongside abundant carnivore bones. Researchers map the orientation, depth, and association of fragments because distribution can reveal movement. Bones carried by a powerful stream tend to sort according to size and density, acquire abrasion, or align with flowing water. Predators may leave tooth marks, concentrate particular body parts, and scatter remains through feeding. A fall may produce characteristic damage and place material beneath the point of entry. None of these signatures is perfectly simple after so much time, but together they narrow what the cave could have done. Water certainly participated in the history. Fine sediment entered the chamber, and mud later enclosed fossils that had already begun to break apart. Yet the assemblage does not look like a collection transported from a distant open-air site by a river. Human elements from throughout the body are present, including small and fragile bones that sustained long-distance movement might have removed or destroyed. The surfaces generally do not show the heavy rounding expected after prolonged tumbling. Some displacement occurred within the cave, and scholars still debate its extent, but water appears more capable of rearranging the deposit than of explaining the original concentration of people. Gravity offers another part of the answer. Bodies or remains entering through a shaft could fall, slide, and settle at its base. Later movement down the sloping floor could separate bones belonging to the same individual. Fractures might occur during entry, as sediment compressed the fossils, or when geological stresses affected mineralized bone. Distinguishing a break made around death from one made thousands of years later requires microscopic study of fracture edges, surfaces, angles, and mineral coatings. Even then, confidence varies. The pit is not a frozen scene. It is a palimpsest in stone, with each event partially written over the last. Carnivores complicate the picture. The chamber contains a remarkable accumulation of bear fossils, largely from an extinct cave bear lineage often identified as Ursus deningeri. Bears may have used accessible areas of the cave for shelter or hibernation, and some probably died naturally underground. Other carnivores are represented as well. Their presence proves that animals could reach parts of the system, but it does not demonstrate that they created the human accumulation. Tooth damage on the human fossils is limited, and the anatomical representation is unlike a straightforward feeding refuse. No persuasive pattern shows that large predators repeatedly hunted people elsewhere and dragged complete bodies to this remote place. Carnivores may have disturbed some material, but their activity does not carry the full explanatory burden. The sediment also records interruptions. At some stage, a flowstone layer formed above fossil-bearing deposits as mineral-rich water laid down calcite. Such formations conceal sediments and provide minimum ages through uranium series dating. Other methods address the fossils and surrounding geological sequence from different directions. Researchers have applied uranium series techniques, electron spin resonance, paleomagnetism, and genetic estimates, among other approaches. Earlier attempts produced a range of ages, sometimes encouraging older estimates. As methods and stratigraphic understanding improved, multiple lines of evidence converged around approximately 430,000 years for the human assemblage. That figure should not be mistaken for the date of a single afternoon. Dating ancient cave deposits brings uncertainty, and approximately 430,000 years is a well-supported placement rather than a calendar appointment. The bodies may have entered over an interval whose duration remains unresolved. Some researchers argue that the demographic pattern and shared anatomy are consistent with a relatively restricted population sample. The depositional process may have repeated, however, and the evidence cannot identify how much time separated one arrival from another. A chamber can combine events occurring years, generations, or longer apart while preserving them in what later appears to be one ancient layer. The cave provided protection, stable cool conditions, and mineral circumstances favorable enough for fragments of ancient genetic material to survive. Even so, preservation was uneven. Extracting DNA required exceptionally careful sampling and contamination control, and success from one bone did not guarantee success from another. This lesser-known chemical dimension matters. The pit preserved not only shapes, but traces of biological information, while simultaneously altering bone through fossilization. The same underground environment that concealed the remains also became their imperfect archive. By combining geology and taphonomy, researchers can eliminate several easy stories. The people did not simply live in the chamber and die where they slept. There is no occupation surface with the ordinary debris of sustained habitation. A flood does not convincingly account for the body part representation and lack of strong transport damage. Predators do not explain the overwhelming human concentration without clearer evidence of feeding and selection. A catastrophic accidental fall involving an entire community is possible to imagine, but difficult to reconcile with everything observed, especially if deposition occurred repeatedly. What remains is a constrained mystery rather than an empty one. The fossils most likely entered through a vertical route, then were redistributed and modified by natural processes. Human action may explain why bodies reached that route. Although geology alone cannot reveal intention, there may have been an entrance now lost, or a different configuration near the shaft. The absence of a known surface connection is not proof that none existed. At the same time, invoking a vanished passage whenever evidence becomes inconvenient would explain too much too easily. The chamber therefore teaches a quiet discipline. Before asking whether ancient people honored their dead, researchers must ask how mud settles, how water sorts a rib from a femur, how bears enter caves, and when calcite closes a layer. Those details can seem less dramatic than torchlight and ritual, but they protect the mystery from becoming a legend. At Sima de los Huesos, geology has obscured the event while preserving its remains. The bone survived because the cave changed, and the cave's changes are precisely what make their journey so hard to recover. Above the chamber, the world changes with a rhythm far greater than any human lifetime. Around 430,000 years ago, the Sierra de Atapuerca stands within a landscape repeatedly reshaped by the climate of the Middle Pleistocene. Cold periods draw glaciers across northern Europe and lower temperatures far beyond the ice itself. Warmer intervals bring expanding woodland, fuller rivers, and new patterns of animal movement. The people whose bones reach the pit do not inhabit a permanently frozen wilderness, nor a Spanish countryside identical to the present. They live within one phase of a restless climatic system, where familiar seasons unfold against longer transformations no individual can perceive from beginning to end. Atapuerca occupies a low limestone ridge near the corridor of La Bureba, a natural passage connecting the basin of the Ebro with the lands drained by the Duero. This geography gives the region an importance out of proportion to the modest height of its hills. Animals moving between the interior of Iberia, the Mediterranean side of the peninsula, and routes leading toward Western Europe can pass through the surrounding country. Human groups can do the same. Water, stone, shelter, plants, and migrating herds make the corridor repeatedly attractive, which helps explain why different Atapuerca sites preserve occupations separated by enormous spans of time. The precise environment associated with the Sima population cannot be reconstructed from the human chamber alone. Fossils within it were deposited under unusual circumstances, and the numerous bears do not represent a complete picture of animals roaming outside. Researchers therefore draw on pollen, sediments, small vertebrates, large mammal remains, and evidence from neighbouring localities. These records suggest a mosaic rather than one unbroken habitat. Woodland occupies sheltered and wetter ground, while open grasslands and patches of scrub spread across other areas. River valleys support denser vegetation. Seasonal changes alter the availability of fruit, seeds, roots, leaves, and prey, forcing both humans and animals to know the landscape intimately. The climate around the time of deposition appears broadly temperate, possibly connected with a warm interglacial interval, although correlation with a particular marine isotope stage remains debated. Temperate does not mean uniformly mild. Winters on the Castilian Plateau can be severe even today, and Middle Pleistocene conditions fluctuate. The evidence remains incomplete, particularly because the chamber may combine remains deposited across an uncertain interval. It is safer to imagine a population accustomed to variability than to fix them inside a single painted background of perpetual forest or snow. Among the trees may stand oaks and other deciduous species, with conifers becoming more prominent under cooler or drier conditions. Beyond them lie meadows and open areas crossed by large herbivores. Deer browse along woodland edges, horses graze in open country. Ancient forms of bison and other bovids move through the region, while rhinoceroses add a massive presence difficult to associate with modern Spain. The wider Atapuerca record also contains elephants and other large mammals whose ranges shift with climate. The exact combination changes between sites and periods, so not every species belongs beside the Sima people at the same moment. Still, their Europe is rich in animals large enough to provide food, hides, fat, bone, and danger. Predators share this country. Lions, leopards, wolves, and hyenas occur in Middle Pleistocene Europe, competing directly or indirectly for carcasses and prey. Bears use caves, sometimes occupying underground spaces seasonally and leaving generations of remains behind. A human group moving through such a landscape does not stand above its food web. It must read tracks, sounds, scavenger activity, wind direction, and the behavior of herd animals. A carcass can be a resource and a warning. A cave can offer protection, yet it may already belong to something stronger. The abundance of bare bones in the Sima is a reminder that the underground world is part of the animal landscape too. The humans themselves probably move through territories larger than the immediate ridge. A group cannot depend indefinitely on resources surrounding one cave. Plant foods ripen in different places and seasons, grazing animals shift their ranges, and stone suitable for tools must be found and carried. Nearby streams and the Arlanzon river system provide water and natural travel lines. Elevated ground offers views across valleys, while wooded cover conceals both prey and predators. Knowledge of where to cross, where animals gather, and where raw materials occur is not incidental information. It is a map preserved through memory and social learning rather than drawn on any surviving surface. Fire may help these people endure cold nights, process food, discourage predators, and maintain social space. but direct evidence linking habitual fire use to the Sima individuals is limited. Other European sites show that humans had used fire long before 430,000 years ago, although the frequency and consistency of that use remain subjects of debate. It would be tempting to illuminate every Atapuerca evening with a controlled hearth. Archaeology permits less certainty. The Sima chamber contains no domestic hearth, and nearby evidence must be interpreted within its own context. What can be said is that these humans possess technological traditions and cooperative abilities adequate for life through demanding seasonal conditions. Their days are structured by practical attention. Weather approaching across open ground matters. The movement of vultures may reveal a carcass. Broken branches and footprints disclose the recent passage of animals. Edible plants require recognition at different stages of growth, and underground foods must be located when little is visible above the soil. Modern assumptions often reduce ancient diets to hunting, but survival in a variable landscape favors flexibility. Later analysis of dental wear and microscopic traces will suggest a mixed diet for the Sima population, one including plant material as well as foods requiring forceful chewing. The countryside around them is not merely scenery for hunters, it is a complex store of seasonal possibilities. Lesser creatures preserve some of the clearest environmental signals. Rodents, insectivores, amphibians, and reptiles occupy narrower ecological ranges than many large mammals. Their tiny teeth and bones can indicate local moisture, temperature, vegetation, and soil conditions. A vole recovered from sediment may contribute more precise climatic information than the dramatic remains of a rhinoceros. This is one of archaeology's quieter reversals. The smallest fossils can reconstruct the broadest landscape. Yet even these indicators describe conditions around deposition, not a single morning experienced by every person represented in the pit. Human presence in Iberia was already ancient. Atapuerca itself preserves evidence of much earlier populations, including remains from Grandolina and Sima del Elefante. The Sima people therefore do not arrive as the first explorers of an untouched peninsula. They belong to a long, discontinuous history of occupation shaped by climatic openings, local persistence, population movement, and perhaps regional disappearance. Sea levels rise and fall, coastlines shift, and ecological barriers strengthen or weaken. Iberia can act as a refuge during some cold phases, but it is never simply isolated from the rest of Europe. Against this changing background, the pit's population becomes easier to imagine without becoming fully knowable. They travel through grass and woodland, encounter animals now absent from Spain, return to dependable water, and recognize routes inherited from others. The caves in the limestone ridge are landmarks within that lived geography, though not every chamber serves the same purpose. Some entrances may shelter animals, some preserve brief human occupations, and one descending route eventually receives the dead. The world above is diverse, seasonal, and alive. Only after those lives enter the darkness does the landscape fall away, leaving their bodies to reveal who they were. The landscape falls silent in the chamber, but the bones do not become anonymous, because so many parts of the skeleton survive. Sima de los Huesos allows researchers to move beyond the usual encounter with a single jaw or isolated skull. The collection represents at least 29 individuals, a minimum established by counting duplicated elements that cannot belong to the same person. That number is conservative, fragmentation, incomplete recovery, and bones still embedded in sediment mean that additional individuals may eventually be recognized. Even so, the assemblage already offers something exceptional for the Middle Pleistocene, not a portrait of one unusual body, but a biological cross-section of people who belong to the same population. They were not all the same age. Teeth preserve stages of eruption and wear, long bones record growth, and the degree to which skeletal elements have fused helps distinguish younger individuals from mature adults. Most appear to have been adolescents or adults, with relatively few very young individuals represented. Exact ages are difficult to assign because growth patterns in an extinct population cannot simply be read from a modern chart, and adult skeletal aging becomes increasingly imprecise. The demographic profile nevertheless matters. If the pit were the result of ordinary mortality accumulated across a complete community, researchers might expect a different distribution. Yet small samples can mislead. Preservation is uneven, and scholars still debate whether the apparent pattern reflects selection, circumstance, or chance. Sex is no easier to establish. Pelvic anatomy provides some of the strongest indicators, while the size and form of other bones can support an assessment. Ancient DNA has also identified biological sex for selected remains, but not every fragment produces genetic information, and isolated bones cannot always be assigned to reconstructed individuals. The assemblage appears to include both females and males. This diversity weakens any simple idea that the chamber held only members of one sex or a narrowly defined activity group. It does not reveal the social relationships between them. They may have come from one local community, several connected groups, or deaths separated by enough time that many never knew one another. Their bodies were powerfully built. Long bones show thick cortical walls, strong joint surfaces, and substantial muscular development. Estimates vary because complete skeletons are rare and body proportions are reconstructed from separate individuals. But adults were generally robust rather than unusually tall. Many probably stood within a range familiar among later Neanderthals and recent humans, while carrying more heavily reinforced skeletons than most people today. Robustness does not mean clumsiness. Dense bone and pronounced muscle attachments reflect bodies adapted to high mechanical loads, repeated movement, and physically demanding lives. They walked fully upright with an efficient human gait and possessed hands capable of controlled tool-making as well as forceful gripping. One of the most informative fossils is a largely complete pelvis known as pelvis I or Elvis. Reconstructed from numerous fragments, it belonged to an adult male and is among the best preserved ancient human pelves ever found. Its broad form contributed to estimates of a wide, massive trunk and a body capable of supporting considerable weight. The individual also suffered serious degeneration and spinal problems, including evidence that movement may have become painful. He nevertheless survived long enough for these conditions to develop extensively. That survival cannot prove organized caregiving, but it suggests that physical impairment did not immediately remove a person from the social world. Other bones preserve the quieter history of growth and bodily stress. Teeth record interruptions in enamel formation that may reflect episodes of nutritional or physiological strain during childhood, described without revealing their precise causes. Limb asymmetry and muscle markings hint at repeated patterns of activity, though assigning a particular occupation from such evidence is risky. Researchers can measure stature, body mass, and proportions, but every estimate rests on comparisons and assumptions. No single skeleton supplies a complete average person. Instead, population form emerges gradually as fragments are associated, measured, scanned, and compared. The collection also reveals natural variation. Some individuals possess larger jaws, heavier brow regions, or differently shaped teeth than others. This matters because fossils found at separate sites are often given evolutionary significance when differences may partly reflect sex, age, or ordinary variation within a population. At Sima, many people share one context, allowing researchers to see how diverse members of a single group can look. The lesson is cautionary. A strange feature need not identify a separate species, while a repeated combination across many individuals carries more weight than an isolated peculiarity. Their teeth offer unusually intimate evidence. Crowns wear down through chewing, grit in food, and possibly the use of the mouth as a practical third hand. Some teeth were lost during life, leaving sockets that remodeled as the jaw healed. Migalon, the individual represented by cranium 5, developed severe dental pathology associated with a broken tooth and infection. The altered bone around the upper jaw shows that this was not a momentary discomfort. He lived with a condition that could have affected eating and caused persistent pain. Whether others softened food or otherwise assisted him cannot be demonstrated, but his survival reminds us that these were not idealized bodies. They carried accumulated damage. Researchers have attempted to determine whether the 29 or more people were closely related. Genetic preservation has produced extraordinary evolutionary information, yet reconstructing a complete family network remains beyond the available data. Shared anatomy indicates a coherent population, not necessarily one household. The chamber should therefore not be pictured as a single family frozen after one disaster, nor should the minimum count be mistaken for 29 articulated burials. Bones belonging to different individuals became mixed, and identifying which fragments join one person can require anatomical fit, size, developmental age, genetic evidence, or chemical comparison. This population-level view changes the emotional scale of the site. One fossil can become an emblem, many reveal recurrence. There were multiple faces, different statures, worn joints, growing teeth, healed injuries, and bodies at different points in adult life. Each person moved through the same broad world described above, but not necessarily in the same season or generation. Their concentration creates a collective presence while refusing to supply a collective biography. What survives in the record suggests a group physically accustomed to strenuous life, diverse in age and sex, and marked by both endurance and disease. It does not tell us their names, roles, affections, or beliefs. Those absences should not flatten them into specimens. The very variation measured in their bones shows that the population was composed of distinct lives. Yet beneath those differences lies a repeated anatomical pattern, especially in the face and teeth, pointing toward a lineage that Europe would later know in a more recognizable form. The pit preserves people before that form was complete, their bodies already carrying the first clear architecture of the Neanderthals. The repeated architecture hinted at in the bodies becomes clearest when the scattered pieces are returned to faces. Sima de los Huesos preserves an extraordinary series of skulls, jaws, and teeth, many reconstructed from fragments recovered in different seasons and different parts of the deposit. They are neither classic Neanderthals nor modern humans with heavier bones. They carry a mosaic of older and more specialized features, revealing evolution not as a clean transformation of one complete form into another, but as different parts of the anatomy changing at different speeds. Cranium 5 Migalon makes that mosaic visible with unusual force. Much of the face survives, including the broad nasal opening, projecting middle face, brow region and upper jaw. Seen from the side, the central face extends forward in a pattern that anticipates later Neanderthals. This is not simply a large version of a recent human face. The bones around the nose and beneath the eyes are arranged differently, shaping an appearance that belongs firmly to another population while remaining recognizably human. Several individuals repeat key elements of this design. Their faces are large relative to the brain case, and the mid-facial region shows derived traits associated with the Neanderthal lineage. Teeth and the bones that support chewing provide some of the strongest similarities. Yet the cranial vault, the upper and rear portion enclosing the brain, lacks the complete suite later seen in classic Neanderthals. The long, low skull with a projecting rear contour is not fully established. The face appears to be moving toward the later pattern before every part of the skull follows. That unevenness supports an important idea about Neanderthal origins. Distinctive anatomy may have accumulated in stages rather than appearing as one coordinated package. Changes related to the face, teeth, and powerful use of the front of the mouth could emerge early, while other features developed later within populations separated and reconnected across Europe. This accretion process does not imply a march toward a predetermined destination. Populations can diverge, mix, disappear, or preserve older traits, and selection can act differently on separate anatomical systems. That pattern explains why the Sima faces matter. Fossils are often too incomplete to show whether a trait belongs to an individual, a regional population, or a wider lineage. Here, repeated anatomy within one assemblage makes the signal clearer. By 430,000 years ago, Neanderthal specialization was already established in Western Europe, although the relationship between these people and later Neanderthal populations cannot be traced as a simple chain. The jaws reinforce the same complicated message. They are robust and lack the projecting chin characteristic of Homo sapiens. Certain aspects resemble Neanderthal mandibles, while others retain more ancestral forms. Their teeth show shared and variable traits: large front teeth, distinctive root and crown shapes, and patterns increasingly common in later Neanderthals. Pronounced wear across some incisors and canines may reflect tough or gritty food, but the front teeth may also have gripped materials during practical tasks. Anatomy, behavior, and lifetime history overlap on the same surface. It is tempting to take the broad nasal opening as a simple adaptation to cold, imagining it warming icy air. The relationship is less direct. Neanderthal facial form results from growth, inherited structure, chewing mechanics, and climate acting in combinations that remain debated. Atapuerca may have experienced relatively temperate conditions, and the Sima faces already possess part of the later configuration. No single environmental explanation fully accounts for this. A feature can arise in one context and persist as descendants occupy another. Brain cases add another layer of caution. The Sima individuals had brain volumes broadly within the range of later large-brained humans, though estimates depend on preservation. Size alone cannot reveal language, imagination, planning, or social depth. A fossil skull preserves the container, not thought. Internal impressions may indicate the organization of the brain surface, but behavioral claims require archaeology rather than cubic centimeters. Their brains were substantial. What they thought inside the Atapuerca landscape remains inaccessible. Even tiny structures contribute to their identity. The temporal bone preserves the inner ear, while exceptionally small auditory bones from the middle ear have survived. These elements can be compared with Neanderthals and modern humans to study inherited shape, balance, and aspects of hearing. Atapuerca auditory anatomy suggests sensitivity across frequencies important in human communication. That does not prove spoken language or reveal its complexity. It shows that evidence can reside in bones small enough to disappear during a less meticulous excavation. Reconstruction should not become portraiture disguised as certainty. Bone guides muscle placement and facial proportions, but it does not preserve the full nose, lips, ears, body hair, wrinkles, or expression. Skin and hair pigmentation cannot be assigned from these skulls alone. Artists make choices where evidence ends. The familiar, dull, brutish creature is a cultural inheritance, not an anatomical conclusion. Heavy brows and a projecting face say nothing about emotional range or intelligence. These people recognized individual expressions and familiar faces like any social human population. Their variation is as revealing as their shared traits. Cranium 4, Cranium 5, and the other skulls are not interchangeable casts. They differ in size, robusticity, age-related change, and shape, because they come from one population. Researchers contest whether a proposed species distinction elsewhere might fall within ordinary variation. Meanwhile, repeated Neanderthal-like features across multiple Sima individuals cannot be dismissed as one person's peculiarity. The assemblage balances a recognizable population pattern with real individuality. Names have struggled to contain that pattern. The fossils were long assigned to Homo heidelbergensis, often used for Middle Pleistocene humans thought to precede Neanderthals and modern humans. But the label gathers fossils from different continents that may not form one species. Analysis of the Sima skulls emphasizes how strongly their derived facial and dental traits align with the Neanderthal branch. Many researchers now describe them as early Neanderthals or members of that lineage, while taxonomic arguments continue. This placement does not make them incomplete versions of a later people. They are a successful population carrying a combination suited to their history. Evolutionary trees are drawn backward, so earlier groups are easily reduced to steps between familiar names. The faces resist that simplification. They show that a lineage can be recognizable long before its best-known form appears, and that identity emerges through patchwork change rather than a sudden boundary. By bone alone, the Sima population stands close to Neanderthal ancestry, while retaining features rooted deeper in the Middle Pleistocene. Anatomy establishes the relationship but leaves room for argument about exact rank and distance. For decades, that was remarkable enough. Then the cave surrendered evidence that fossils this old were scarcely expected to preserve. Molecules recovered from the bones would confirm part of the anatomical story, overturn another, and connect the chamber in Spain to a population first recognized thousands of kilometers away in Siberia. The molecules promised by the chamber did not arrive as a clear answer. They arrived as fragments so short and chemically damaged that, in another context, they might have been dismissed as noise. Ancient DNA begins breaking apart soon after death. Water, heat, microbes, oxidation, and time reduce chromosomes into scattered pieces, while DNA from excavators and laboratory workers can enter a specimen thousands of generations later. At approximately 430,000 years old, the Sima remains stood far beyond what had once seemed a practical limit for retrieving human genetic material. Mitochondria, the energy-producing structures outside the nucleus, possess a much smaller genome. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line, so it follows one narrow thread through a person's ancestry. Its abundance within cells can make it easier to recover from ancient bone, but that advantage carries a warning. A mitochondrial sequence can reveal the history of one maternal lineage. it cannot by itself represent the full ancestry of a population. In late 2013, researchers announced an almost complete mitochondrial genome recovered from a Sima thigh bone known as femur thigh. Anatomy had already drawn the fossils toward the Neanderthal lineage. Geography seemed to support the same expectation. These were Western European humans with emerging Neanderthal features. Yet the mitochondrial sequence did not group most closely with later Neanderthals. It shared a more recent maternal connection with Denisovans, the archaic humans first identified through DNA from Denisova Cave in southern Siberia. A bone beneath Spain had produced a genetic signal pointing unexpectedly toward a lineage known from the far side of Eurasia. The result did not mean that Denisovans had been found at Atapuerca, nor did it overturn the anatomical evidence and transform the Sima population into Western Denisovans. It showed that one genetic tree disagreed with the simplest reading of the bones. The Sima people might have belonged to a population ancestral to both later Neanderthals and Denisovans, or early members of the Neanderthal branch might have retained a maternal lineage later lost and replaced. With one small inherited molecule, those possibilities were difficult to separate. The more decisive test required nuclear DNA, the immensely larger archive containing contributions from many lines of descent. Recovering it from material this old was even harder. Researchers selected specimens carefully, removed contaminated surfaces, took small samples, and used methods designed to capture ultra-short molecules. Patterns of chemical damage helped distinguish genuinely ancient fragments from recent contamination. The outcome was not a complete, high-coverage genome of the kind obtained from much younger remains. It was a limited collection of sequences from 2 Sima specimens, yet enough informative positions survived to compare them with Neanderthal, Denisovan, and modern human DNA. Published in 2016, that comparison changed the picture. The nuclear sequences aligned the Sima individuals more closely with Neanderthals than with Denisovans. Genetics had now confirmed the main direction suggested by their faces and teeth. The population belonged on the Neanderthal side of the split between those 2 archaic lineages, because the fossils are about 430,000 years old. The Neanderthal and Denisovan populations must have separated before that time. The cave thus provided not merely an identity for its inhabitants, but a minimum point deep in the branching history of Eurasian humans. The apparent contradiction between nuclear and mitochondrial DNA is only a contradiction if human populations are imagined as clean branches that never touch and never lose genetic variation. Real populations divide imperfectly. Maternal lines disappear through chance, especially when populations are small. Others can spread after contact and eventually replace lineages that were once common. A family tree drawn from one molecule may therefore differ from the broader population history written across the chromosomes. One influential explanation proposes that early Neanderthal lineage populations carried Denisovan-like mitochondrial DNA, as the Sima individual did, later. Gene flow from a population related to African hominins may have introduced a different mitochondrial lineage, which then spread through Neanderthals and became the form recovered from their later fossils. This is a plausible model, not a witnessed event. The precise source, timing, scale, and route of any such contact remain uncertain. Other demographic histories can be tested as more ancient genomes appear. Whatever scenario proves closest to reality, the signal warns against treating continents as sealed containers. A Denisovan-like maternal lineage in Spain does not require a Denisovan migration from Siberia to Iberia. Denisova Cave is simply where science first recognized that population, not necessarily the center of its entire history. Likewise, Neanderthals did not arise everywhere in Europe at once and remain unchanged. Their ancestors were populations moving, dividing, mixing, and losing diversity across immense spans of time. The genetic evidence also changes how names are used. Calling the Sima people early Neanderthals describes their evolutionary affinity without claiming that they possessed every feature or genetic pattern of Neanderthals living hundreds of thousands of years later. They occupy a deep portion of that branch, after its separation from Denisovans but before the later Neanderthal population took its familiar form. Homo heidelbergensis may still appear in discussions of Middle Pleistocene fossils, yet DNA makes it increasingly difficult to place all such remains from Europe, Africa, and Asia inside one simple ancestral species. These sequences do not reveal whether the individuals in the pit were siblings, parents, or members of one close family. The recovered nuclear material is too limited for a complete pedigree, nor can DNA tell why the bodies entered the chamber. It identifies biological relationships across populations, not intentions at the edge of a shaft. Genetics can connect Atapuerca to Siberia across evolutionary time, while remaining silent about the final journey of a particular person. The work also carries an unavoidable cost. Sampling removes a small amount of fossil, and no destroyed bone powder can be restored. Researchers must balance the information obtainable today against methods that may exist tomorrow. The success at Sima encouraged the search for DNA in older and warmer contexts, but preservation is never guaranteed by age alone. Cool, stable cave conditions, rapid burial, bone chemistry, and chance all matter. Two fossils lying near one another can yield very different amounts of endogenous material. What emerged from the darkness was therefore not a genetic portrait but a set of intersecting histories. Nuclear DNA placed the population near the roots of Neanderthals. Mitochondrial DNA preserved an older maternal connection that later Neanderthals did not retain. Together, they transformed the human family tree from a sequence of replacements into a braided record of separation, contact, and loss. Yet genes describe inheritance, not the daily use of a body. They cannot show the strain of climbing a ridge, the weight carried in one hand, or the effort required to survive winter with an injured spine. To approach those experiences, the investigation must return from molecules to bone, where muscle, movement, and repeated labor left their slower signatures. The return from genetics to bone brings the Sima population closer, but it also requires restraint. A skeleton records forces that acted upon a body muscles pulling at attachment sites, joints absorbing repeated loads, teeth grinding food, and injuries healing or failing to heal. It does not preserve a list of occupations. A thick arm bone cannot identify a hunter, and a damaged spine cannot reveal who carried food for its owner. The evidence describes physical histories, while the social lives behind them must be approached through probabilities rather than certainty. Their limb bones belong to people accustomed to demanding movement. Dense shafts and broad joint surfaces suggest substantial bodies exposed to high mechanical loads. The terrain around Atapuerca required walking across uneven ground, climbing slopes, carrying stone and food, and sometimes moving rapidly in the presence of prey or predators. Yet robust skeletons were also part of their inherited anatomy. Researchers cannot divide every feature neatly between genes and work. These people were powerfully built, but no bone tells us how often one individual hunted, gathered, butchered, dug, or remained near a resting place. The upper limbs preserve differences between sides of the body. while the teeth provide another route to repeated action. Ancient humans sometimes gripped hides, sinew, plant fibers, or other materials between the front teeth, turning the mouth into a third hand. A stone edge drawn close to the face could occasionally scrape the enamel. On several Sima teeth, the direction of such marks has been used to infer which hand controlled the tool. The pattern supports predominantly right-handed behavior, as in later Neanderthals and living humans. Although the sample is too limited to define every individual, chewing left a broader record. A study published in 2026 examined how wear was distributed across the molar surfaces of the Sima population. Its occlusal fingerprint analysis challenged the familiar image of these early Neanderthal lineage humans as almost exclusive meat-eaters. The wear pattern was more consistent, with a mixed diet containing broadly comparable contributions from animal and plant foods. That conclusion does not turn every meal into equal portions. It describes accumulated chewing across individuals and time, not a daily menu. Plants could have supplied underground storage organs, seeds, nuts, fruit, tender leaves, and other seasonal resources, while animal foods offered flesh, organs, marrow, and fat. The fossils do not specify which species were eaten or how foods were prepared, nor does dental wear alone show whether meat came from hunting or scavenging. What it does reveal is flexibility. The Atapuerca landscape was not merely a field of large game. It was a changing store of foods whose locations and seasons had to be learned, remembered, and shared. Teeth also record the cost of that life. Grit carried on food accelerates wear, hard objects can chip enamel, while repeated gripping can load the front teeth in ways unrelated to eating. Migalon, represented by cranium 5, suffered severe dental disease, including a broken upper premolar followed by chronic infection and changes in the surrounding bone. Grooves on teeth from the site have sometimes been interpreted as evidence of toothpick use. If so, they show practical attempts to relieve irritation, not prehistoric dentistry in any organized modern sense. Pain is easier to infer than assistance. An infected tooth can throb for weeks or years, and degenerative joints can make ordinary movement difficult. Pelvis 1, the older male called Elvis, preserves a nearly complete lower back and pelvis marked by several abnormalities. These included slippage where the lowest lumbar vertebra met the sacrum, curvature of the lower spine, and contact between neighboring vertebral spines. By the time he died, he may have experienced substantial back pain and restricted movement. He survived into later adulthood. That survival is often presented as evidence that others cared for him. It is a reasonable possibility, especially if his mobility limited participation in strenuous tasks. But the bones cannot show how dependent he was every day. Symptoms can fluctuate. People adapt their movements, and a person unable to chase large animals may still gather, process food, maintain tools, watch for danger, or transmit knowledge. Social support need not mean constant nursing. The fossil permits a spectrum ranging from occasional help to sustained care, without selecting one point on it. An even more affecting case is cranium 14, nicknamed Benjamina. This young individual experienced premature fusion of part of the skull, a condition called craniosynostosis, which produced pronounced asymmetry as the brain and skull continued to grow. Benjamina survived for years, probably reaching roughly 10 years of age. The condition may have involved developmental difficulties, although the degree cannot be reconstructed confidently. Survival shows that the abnormality was compatible with life. It does not by itself reveal whether intensive care was required. Yet childhood is inherently dependent. Every young member of the population needed food, protection, teaching, and access to the group. A visibly different child surviving for years is therefore relevant to discussions of tolerance and care, even if it cannot prove compassion in the modern emotional sense. The cautious conclusion is not that Sima possessed hospitals or formal caregivers. It is that bodily difference did not necessarily lead to immediate abandonment, and that social life created possibilities for survival beyond individual physical performance. Even apparently healthy individuals depended on cooperation. Large animal carcasses had to be located, defended, opened, and transported or consumed before competitors arrived. Plant foods required knowledge passed across seasons. Tool-making traditions survived because techniques were learned from others. None of this proves language of a particular complexity, formal kinship rules, or ritual obligations. It does show why a solitary image of Middle Pleistocene life is biologically and archaeologically inadequate. Survival was produced by bodies acting within groups. The injuries in the pit do not all have the same origin. Falls, accidents, repetitive strain, disease, and violence can leave overlapping marks. Many bones fractured after death as bodies entered the shaft. Sediment shifted, and fossilization made them brittle. Identifying trauma from life therefore depends on healing, fracture form, and microscopic context. A healed wound proves survival after injury. An unhealed break may belong to the moment of death or to a much later geological event. Certainty must be earned fracture by fracture. Together, these traces reveal resilient but vulnerable people. They ate a varied diet, worked with practiced hands, endured infection, and sometimes lived for years with bodies that differed from the population norm. Cooperation is strongly compatible with the evidence. While its emotions and rules remain lost, the pit preserves no general story of harmony. One skull bears injuries of another kind, 2 deliberate blows delivered to the forehead around the time of death. To understand what happened to Cranium 17, the investigation must separate lethal violence from the fate of everyone else in the chamber. The final sentence written into Cranium 17 is more direct than most messages carried by ancient bone. This individual did not merely live with injury, and the skull does not preserve the slow remodeling that follows survival. 2 wounds penetrate the frontal region above the left eye. They were made around the time of death, before the bone had dried and become brittle, and their repeated shape indicates separate impacts delivered by the same object or by objects with closely similar striking edges. In a chamber filled with fractures caused by falling, pressure, excavation, and geological movement, these 2 lesions stand apart. They provide compelling evidence that one member of the Sima population died through interpersonal violence. The conclusion emerged only after a patient reconstruction. Cranium 17 was assembled from dozens of fragments recovered during different excavation seasons. Once joined, the pieces preserved much of the face and cranial vault, allowing researchers to place breaks back into their anatomical relationships. Many cracks crossed the skull in ways expected from postmortem damage. The 2 frontal injuries were different. Each formed a depressed fracture with a similar outline, but their orientations showed that they are not 2 edges of one accidental break. The bone had responded while still fresh, bending and fracturing in patterns associated with force applied near death. One blow alone might invite several possibilities. A person could strike a rock during a fall, be hit by falling stone, or suffer an accident involving a tool. 2 localized impacts of closely matching form are much harder to explain that way. For a fall to create them, the forehead would need to contact nearly the same kind of projection twice, at distinct angles, without producing a pattern more consistent with uncontrolled collision. The researchers judged repeated intentional blows to be the most economical explanation. This was not a diagnosis based merely on cracks. It rested on fracture morphology, placement, symmetry of the lesions, and comparison with damage elsewhere in the assemblage. Neither wound shows healing. That absence means death followed before the skull could begin repairing itself, although bone alone cannot establish whether either blow was instantly fatal. The frontal bone protects the brain, and sufficient force in this area can cause hemorrhage, swelling, and severe neurological injury. The combined trauma was potentially lethal. When the evidence is translated into ordinary language, the result is often called murder. The word captures deliberate killing, but it also carries legal assumptions about intent and responsibility that archaeology cannot recover. Lethal interpersonal violence is the more precise description. The weapon did not survive in a form that can be matched to the injuries. A stone tool, a heavy piece of wood, or another hard object with an appropriate striking surface could have made them. Researchers cannot determine whether the assailant faced the victim, stood above them, or struck during a struggle. They cannot identify right or left-handed action confidently from the wound pattern. Even the sequence of the blows is unknown. The skull freezes the result of force, not the movement before it. Yet the evidence changes the human atmosphere around the pit. These people cooperated to obtain food, learn skills, and raise young, but cooperation never guarantees peace. Competition, fear, anger, punishment, defense, or conflict between groups are all possible in a socially complex population. None can be selected from Cranium-17. Violence does not make these humans primitive, just as care would not make them modern. Both are behaviors available within social life, where dependence and conflict can exist among the same people. It is equally important not to spread one individual's injuries across the entire assemblage. Cranium-17 proves that at least one person suffered lethal violence. It does not demonstrate that all 29 or more individuals were executed, massacred, or killed during one confrontation. Comparable lethal wounds have not been identified on every skull, and much of each skeleton is incomplete. Some deaths may have resulted from illness, accidents, predation, age, or causes that leave no skeletal trace. The chamber may combine events separated by generations. A dramatic group killing remains a story in search of evidence. The wounds nevertheless connect death to deposition in an important way. If Cranium-17 was killed outside the chamber, the body or remains later travelled into the cave system. The violence explains why this person died, but not how the skull reached the bottom of the shaft. There is no sign that an attacker struck the forehead inside the present fossil chamber, and its remote geometry makes that scenario unlikely. A second action, whether performed by people or produced by natural transport, must therefore be considered after the killing. This separation between cause of death and fate of the body protects the investigation from a common shortcut. Finding homicide in the pit does not prove that the pit was used to conceal a crime. If bodies were regularly placed into the shaft, a violently killed individual could have received the same treatment as others who died differently. Conversely, if natural processes carried remains downward, the killer may have had no connection to the deposition at all. One event is written in the forehead, the other must be reconstructed from the chamber. Claims that Cranium-17 represents the world's earliest murder should also be handled carefully. Older fossils sometimes preserve trauma interpreted as violence, but damage, dating, and cause can remain disputed. The Sima case is among the earlier strong examples of lethal interpersonal violence, because the two perimortem impacts form such a persuasive repeated pattern. Earliest depends on which evidence scholars accept and on future discoveries. The importance of the skull does not require a record book title. Almost everything personal remains withheld. The surviving anatomy has not yielded a name, role, relationship to the assailant, or motive. Researchers cannot reconstruct whether the individual belonged to the same group as the attacker or encountered strangers. Nor do the wounds reveal whether others witnessed the event, attempted aid, retaliated, or mourned. The evidence is vivid precisely because it stops so sharply. Two impacts cross the distance of 430,000 years, while the surrounding human story has vanished. Cranium 17 therefore narrows one mystery and deepens another. At least one death in the assemblage was not a passive result of disease or landscape. Someone applied force twice, and a human life ended. Later, that body joined a concentration unlike any ordinary occupation deposit. The skull makes the chamber harder to explain as a single accident, yet it cannot by itself establish deliberate disposal. For that argument, researchers turn to the demographic pattern, the completeness of the skeletal representation, the absence of settlement debris, and one object whose presence in the pit has attracted almost as much attention as the bones a carefully made handaxe of red quartzite known as Excalibur. The object called Excalibur enters the story without the brilliance its name suggests. It is not a sword or metal. It is a handaxe, a large stone implement shaped on both faces, belonging to the Aculean, or Mode II technological tradition. Its reddish, light brown quartzite is crossed by veins, and its outline narrows toward a carefully formed working end. Among thousands of human fossil fragments and abundant carnivore bones, this single piece is the only lithic artifact recovered from Sima de los Huesos. Its solitude is what gives it power. The handaxe measures about 155 millimeters long, 97 millimeters wide, and 58 millimeters thick, with a mass of approximately 685 grams. One face is flatter and the other more convex, producing the almond-like form archaeologists describe as amygdaloid. Its maker reduced a quartzite cobble to establish the volume, then refined the margins and distal end. The sequence required planning and control. Excalibur was not an accidental splinter that observers mistook for a tool. It was deliberately made. What cannot be established so securely is why it entered the pit. The quartzite was of good quality and appears to have been selected less often than other materials at nearby Atapuerca sites. The tool is relatively large and carefully finished. These features have encouraged the idea that it possessed special value. Yet quality is not the same as symbolism. A well-made handaxe can be practical, and Achaean toolmakers invested time in symmetrical forms. Beauty, utility, skill, and social meaning need not have been separate categories for its maker. Early descriptions sometimes emphasize that Excalibur showed no use, and therefore may have been produced as an offering. Microscopic study makes the matter less certain. Sandy sediment abraded the artifact, especially its edges and raised ridges, potentially erasing traces left by cutting or other work. The surviving surface cannot prove that the handaxe was unused. It might have been a valued old tool, a newly made object, or something between those possibilities. Its last destination is visible, its previous life is not. The surrounding absence remains remarkable. There are no flakes showing that someone manufactured or repaired tools inside the chamber. There is no broader stone assemblage. hearth, butchery surface, or ordinary occupation debris. Excalibur was not one implement forgotten among the equipment of people living at the bottom. Its isolation invites a relationship with the human remains because it was embedded within their deposit. But archaeological association is not a preserved gesture. No hand gripped it, no articulated skeleton held it, and no marked grave enclosed it with one known individual. In 2006, Eudald Carbonell and Marina Mosquera argued that the handaxe could carry symbolic meaning within an intentional accumulation of the dead. Under that interpretation, people brought bodies to a shaft and placed or dropped them into the darkness. At some point, they added a finely made handaxe. Excalibur would then be a mortuary offering, and perhaps the earliest known object deliberately deposited in connection with human death. The hypothesis is powerful because it joins two exceptional facts: a unique concentration of bodies and a unique artifact. It also contains two separate claims that must not be fused automatically. The first is that humans intentionally disposed of bodies at Sima de los Huesos. The second is that the handaxe was deliberately offered as part of that behavior. Evidence for the first does not prove the second. A tool could fall from a hand near the shaft, be discarded, or enter with sediment. Conversely, even if the handaxe arrived by accident, the bodies might still have been deliberately placed. Each step requires its own support. The case for human disposal rests mainly on the bones rather than Excalibur. All regions of the skeleton are represented, including small and fragile elements. This suggests that complete bodies entered the cave instead of selected bones being carried from an exposed, weathered deposit. Carnivore modification is too limited to explain the concentration, and water transport does not fit the preservation and anatomical representation. The chamber lacks evidence of habitation, while human remains are concentrated differently from bears and other carnivores. Together, these observations make repeated human involvement a serious, perhaps leading explanation. But disposal is not identical to burial. No grave pit was dug in the fossil chamber. The skeletons were not preserved in articulated positions, and there are no stone structures outlining individual graves. If people lowered or cast bodies into a natural shaft, the behavior would still show awareness of death and a repeated way of handling corpses. It would not reveal whether they mourned, feared contamination, protected bodies from scavengers, separated the dead from the living, or believed that anything continued after death. The word ritual can therefore illuminate and mislead. A repeated action governed by social custom may reasonably be called ritualized without implying priests, prayers, or a detailed spiritual system. Even practical disposal can acquire memory and meaning when a group returns to the same place. Yet archaeology cannot hear what was said at the opening, determine who participated, or know whether every body received the same treatment. The chamber may record a mortuary practice while preserving almost none of its emotional content. Alternative routes remain possible. The ancient cave differed from the present one, and an entrance closer to the pit may once have existed. Individuals could have fallen accidentally, though the unusual demographic pattern and repeated concentration make a simple natural trap difficult to accept. A catastrophic event outside the cave might have killed many people whose bodies were then brought together, but no event has been identified. Water and gravity redistributed the remains after entry, weakening any attempt to reconstruct the original arrangement. Uncertainty survives not because all explanations are equally strong, but because none reproduces every missing step. Excalibur sits precisely inside that uncertainty. If placed intentionally, It suggests that an object could stand for a person, an event, or an obligation more than 400,000 years ago. That would not prove modern symbolic thought, but it would push meaningful mortuary action deep into the Neanderthal lineage. If it arrived accidentally, its fame becomes a warning about building a ceremony around one artifact. Either way, the handaxe cannot carry the whole argument. The strongest conclusion is quieter than the legend. Human beings probably played a role in forming the accumulation, and the single handaxe may have shared that deliberate journey. The evidence permits a mortuary interpretation but does not compel a funeral scene. Between careless disposal and elaborate ceremony lies a wide field of human behavior, repeated custom, practical concern, social memory, and acts whose meanings were understood without ever being written. To decide how far the Sima evidence can take us, the competing explanations must now be placed beside one another and tested against the entire chamber rather than its most famous object. The chamber has now supplied every tempting element of a funeral story: many human bodies, an inaccessible shaft, almost no ordinary tools, and one remarkable handaxe. Taphonomy asks a colder question. What sequence of physical processes is actually required to create the deposit before intention can be inferred? The bones must be tested against gravity, water, carnivores, falling sediment, and the changing architecture of the cave. An explanation succeeds only if it accounts not for one dramatic object, but for the entire pattern. The simplest possibility is ordinary occupation. Perhaps people lived somewhere near the chamber, died there, or left remains among the debris of daily activity. Almost everything argues against this. Sima de los Huesos contains no hearths, no food refuse, no floor repeatedly trampled by inhabitants, and no stoneworking debris. More than 7,000 human fossils have been recovered, yet Excalibur remains the only recognized stone artifact. The bones show no cut marks, percussion damage, or burning that would indicate butchery, cannibalism, or the processing of corpses. Whatever the chamber was, it was not a home preserved beneath normal domestic waste. Carnivores provide a more plausible natural agent because their own bones are abundant. Cave bears entered the underground system over generations, and some apparently fell or became trapped. Could predators have dragged human carcasses into the same place? Such accumulations usually carry a signature: repeated tooth pits and scores, crushed ends of long bones, missing nutrient-rich portions, and damage concentrated where animals chewed. The human assemblage does not show that pattern. Fewer than 4% of examined remains bear modifications attributed to carnivores, and several skulls retain delicate facial bones unlikely to survive intensive feeding. This does not mean no animal ever touched a human body. Isolated marks are compatible with bears scavenging carcasses after they had reached the chamber. Rodents also gnawed a small number of surfaces. Those visitors helped modify an accumulation already present. They do not adequately explain its origin. The bears themselves need not have arrived by the same route, or for the same reason as the humans. Similar final locations can be produced by different histories inside a cave that change through time. Water is another powerful suspect. Underground floods can disarticulate bodies, sort bones by size and density, round their edges, and concentrate remains where a current loses energy. Yet the principal human-bearing deposit, Lithostratigraphic Unit 6, consists of fine red clay laid down in a low-energy environment. It lacks the foreign stones expected if a forceful stream had swept bodies over a long distance. Dripping and slowly moving water carried fine sediment. but the geological evidence does not describe a torrent capable of gathering 29 people from elsewhere. Water still mattered after deposition. Calcite formed on some bones, manganese stained others, and occasional pooling affected remains resting on the chamber floor. Gravity and local movement scattered pieces downslope, while later disturbance separated fragments belonging to the same skull. These processes explain why complete skeletons are no longer articulated. They do not explain why all regions of the human skeleton, including small hand, foot, and ear bones, entered the system. That representation suggests that bodies arrived substantially complete and disarticulated within or near the chamber. The natural trap hypothesis therefore deserves a direct test. An ancient opening may have led to a vertical drop of roughly 13 meters. A person moving through darkness could fall, and one fatal accident requires no ceremony. Bears demonstrate that the cave could kill. But multiplying one accident until it produces the entire human assemblage creates problems. Why did so many members of one population enter this remote route, while leaving no evidence that they used the chamber? Why are infants scarce? And why do the bones not preserve widespread fresh fractures expected if every death resulted from a long fall? About 4% of postcranial fractures have been classified as occurring around the time of death. Most breakage happened later, when bones had dried and pressure from overlying sediment fractured them. A body can survive a fall with surprisingly little skeletal damage, especially if soft tissue absorbs force, so the fracture evidence cannot eliminate accidents. Nor can the demographic profile prove deliberate selection. Age estimates are imperfect, preservation is unequal, and 29 individuals remain a small sample. Still, repeated accidental entry is less economical than it first appears. A single catastrophe might bring many bodies together without repeated visits. Flood, collapse, conflict, disease, or another crisis could kill a group outside, after which natural forces or survivors moved the dead. No sedimentary layer records a violent flood delivering them, and no roof fall explains their concentration. Cranium-17 proves lethal violence in one case, not a massacre. The absence of butchery marks also distinguishes Sima from Grandolina, where much older human remains were processed with stone tools. At Sima, a catastrophic death remains possible, but its mechanism has left no independent trace. Intentional human placement currently explains more observations with fewer unsupported steps. Complete bodies could have been brought to an opening and released into the shaft. This accounts for the anatomical representation, the lack of occupation debris, the limited carnivore damage, and the concentration of one population. It does not require people to enter the final chamber, dig graves, or arrange skeletons. The act may have occurred at an entrance that later closed, leaving geology to move the remains the final distance. Even this leading interpretation has limits. A 2018 analysis compared skeletal part frequencies at Sima and other fossil accumulations using machine learning methods. It concluded that non-human and abiotic contributions could not be excluded from the final form of the assemblage. Skeletal representation alone therefore cannot function as a fingerprint of mortuary behavior. Later, taphonomic work strengthens the case that complete bodies were present, and that carnivores acted mainly as secondary scavengers, but the debate demonstrates how strongly conclusions depend on which features are given the greatest weight. The most defensible reconstruction combines agents rather than choosing a single one. Humans probably introduced bodies. Gravity carried them downward. Decomposition separated joints. Bears and rodents occasionally disturbed bone. Water deposited clay and minerals. Sediment pressure caused most fractures, and later, cave visitors disrupted the upper layers. Intentional placement can begin the sequence without controlling everything that followed. What remains unresolved is the rhythm of that beginning. One geological unit can contain bodies deposited on one day, across several seasons, or over generations too brief for available dating to separate. Anatomical similarity suggests a local population, while the age distribution has been read as evidence of a catastrophic event. Neither establishes simultaneity. Before the pit can be called a repeated mortuary place, one question must be faced: did these people return to the shaft again and again, or did a single lost event deliver the dead all at once? The question of rhythm cannot be answered by looking at the chamber as if it were a photograph. Sima de los Huesos is a long exposure. Bodies entered, soft tissues disappeared, joints separated, clay accumulated, water moved through cracks, and bones shifted before becoming fossils. Hundreds of thousands of years later, excavation reveals objects close together in space, but does not automatically reveal how close they were in time. A deposit that appears simultaneous at archaeological scale may conceal days, decades, or several human generations. The age commonly given for the fossils, about 430,000 years, describes the assemblage as a whole. It is not a calendar date stamped on every skeleton. Researchers obtain that chronology by combining several methods applied to sediments, mineral crusts, and the wider stratigraphic sequence. Luminescence dating estimates when mineral grains were last exposed to light or heat before burial. Uranium series measurements constrain the growth of cave carbonates, while paleomagnetism and other methods provide additional limits. Their agreement places the humans securely in the Middle Pleistocene, but none can date each person's death to a particular year. Even the best error range is enormous beside a human lifetime. An estimate such as 433,000 years with an uncertainty of thousands of years can locate a population in evolutionary history while remaining unable to distinguish one winter from a century of returns. Improved dating may narrow the geological bracket, yet the material itself imposes limits. Bones within the same sedimentary unit can be nearly contemporary without having entered together. Conversely, bodies deposited during one event can become separated as water and gravity rearrange their parts. Stratigraphy supplies an important clue. Most human fossils come from the lower red clay portion of Unit 6, and they are not divided into a succession of clearly sterile layers that would mark long pauses. This concentration suggests a relatively restricted depositional interval. It does not prove a single day. Slow sedimentation can leave repeated events touching one another, while later disturbance can blur boundaries that once existed. The chamber offers no sequence of individual graves, each sealed before the next was made. It preserves a mingled accumulation. The demographic pattern has often been used to argue for catastrophe. Adolescents and young adults are unusually numerous. Very young children are scarce, and only a few individuals reached advanced adult age. In an attritional cemetery formed through ordinary deaths over many generations, high childhood mortality and a broader spread of ages might be expected. A concentration of people in the strength of youth can resemble deaths produced by one exceptional event. But the comparison depends on assumptions about fertility, childhood survival, and how age was estimated from extinct humans. The current minimum of 29 individuals was established mainly by identifying repeated teeth and skeletal elements that cannot belong to the same body. This is a minimum count, not a recovered census. Unequal preservation may hide infants whose small bones were easier to lose, and age categories become less precise after adulthood. Demography can make a catastrophe plausible, but it cannot name one, and no sedimentary or skeletal signature confirms that everyone died together. If a single crisis occurred, its form remains unknown. A violent encounter should not be inferred from cranium-17 alone. Disease could kill many people without marking bone, but the pit contains no pathogen identified as the cause of a group death. Exposure, food shortage, drowning, or an accident elsewhere could also leave little direct skeletal evidence. Each proposal must then explain why survivors, natural forces, or both brought substantially complete bodies to the same cave opening. Catastrophe reduces the number of death events. It does not solve deposition. Repeated placement creates a different image. A local group may have used the shaft whenever a member died, returning to a known opening across years or generations. This would explain why people with different causes of death, including one victim of violence, shared the same destination. The practice need not have involved entry into the deep chamber. Bodies could have been carried only as far as an accessible threshold and released downward. The darkness below may have remained unseen. Repetition would imply memory. Someone had to know where the opening was and regard it as the appropriate place for the dead. Younger members could learn that location and action from older ones. Such continuity is socially meaningful even if the original motive was practical. Keeping corpses away from living areas, limiting scavenger access, or avoiding the labor of digging might establish a custom. Over time, practical and emotional meanings could coexist. Archaeology cannot separate them when no associated gestures, markings, or structures survive. Yet the word cemetery risks projecting later institutions backward. There is no evidence of named plots, marked graves, formal ceremonies, or permanent guardianship of the place. Nor can the assemblage show that every individual belonged to one community or received equal treatment. The Sima deposit could represent selective inclusion. Certain dead were placed there while others were treated in ways that left no fossil trace. The missing infants might reflect preservation, mortality, sampling, or a rule about who entered. No option can presently be isolated. Excalibur does little to resolve the timing. One handaxe among many people could have accompanied one body, commemorated a collective event, marked the beginning or end of repeated use, or entered accidentally at any point. The more symbolic weight assigned to the tool, the more important this chronological silence becomes. The fairest conclusion is that the bodies entered during a geologically narrow interval that remains broad at the scale of human experience. Their age profile is compatible with unusual mortality, while their varied conditions and one violent death are compatible with repeated disposal. Neither pattern defeats the other. Dating establishes deep antiquity. Stratigraphy shows concentration. Demography raises the possibility of selection or catastrophe. None provides the missing clock. That uncertainty does not diminish what the Sima population reveals. Whether carried after one calamity or brought over many returns, these bodies did not arrive as ordinary occupation waste. The same place received a remarkable number of members of one ancient population, and human agency remains the leading explanation. What cannot yet be recovered is the tempo of the action, and therefore the social memory behind it. The distinction matters because repeated return would imply a durable convention, while one collective deposition might reflect an emergency never repeated. Both require recognition that dead bodies demanded some response. Neither proves belief in an afterlife, grief expressed in a familiar form, or the concept of burial held by later humans. To move further, Sima must be placed beside other ancient sites where humans accumulated, manipulated, protected, or abandoned their dead. Comparison can show what is truly exceptional in the Spanish pit and what belongs to a wider history of how human populations confronted death. Sima de los Huesos becomes clearer when it is not treated as the first rung on a ladder leading inevitably toward modern funerals. The archaeological record contains many ways of responding to a human body. Corpses were sometimes abandoned, consumed, cut apart, protected from scavengers, placed in natural hollows, carried into caves, or covered in excavated pits. Similar bones can result from very different actions, while similar intentions can leave different traces. Comparison, therefore, begins with physical evidence, not with the assumption that every unusual accumulation expresses the same belief. The closest contrast lies elsewhere in the Atapuerca hills, at Grandolina, in deposits roughly twice as old as Sima. The remains assigned to Homo antecessor were mixed with animal bones and stone tools. Many human fossils bear cut marks, percussion damage, peeling, and fractures made while the bone was fresh. The pattern records skinning, defleshing, disarticulation, and access to marrow and brain. Human bodies were processed in broadly the same manner as edible animals, leading researchers to interpret the assemblage as strong evidence of cannibalism. Grandolina demonstrates why absence matters at Sima. No comparable field of cut marks crosses the Sima skeletons. Their long bones were not systematically opened for marrow, their skulls were not repeatedly broken to extract brains, and their remains were not discarded among food waste. Whatever caused the bodies to enter the pit, it was different from the intensive processing visible only a short distance away. Human treatment of the dead had no single Atapuerca tradition lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Far to the south, the Rising Star cave system in South Africa offers a more intriguing parallel. Between approximately 335,000 and 241,000 years ago, bodies of Homo naledi reached remote underground chambers without an ordinary occupation assemblage surrounding them. Multiple individuals and broad skeletal representation led researchers to propose deliberate disposal. Later excavations identified concentrations interpreted by their investigators as bodies placed in shallow pits and covered with sediment. The claim of intentional burial remains actively debated, because other specialists argue that the boundaries of those features, routes into the chambers, and sedimentary evidence do not yet exclude alternative processes. Rising Star and Sima share darkness, difficult access, multiple bodies, and a scarcity of everyday debris. Neither similarity proves that the populations perform the same action. Rising Star is younger, formed in a different geology, and preserves a different hominin species. The proposed naledi graves depend on evidence for excavated and refilled features. Sima has no individual grave cuts or articulated bodies. Its strongest case concerns the introduction of corpses into a natural shaft, not burial beneath a prepared covering. The comparison strengthens the possibility that more than one human lineage used deep caves for the dead, while leaving motive and method open. Clearer graves appear much later in the record. At Kafza Cave in what is now Israel, early Homo sapiens were placed in Middle Paleolithic burials around 100,000 years ago. Several bodies retained anatomical relationships indicating that they decomposed where they had been laid. Grave outlines and body positions provide evidence of intentional placement, while the association of a juvenile with deer antler has often been interpreted as a deliberate offering. Ochre and shells elsewhere in the occupation show that these people also selected materials for purposes extending beyond immediate nutrition, although not every coloured object belonged to a burial. The evidential difference from Sima is fundamental. Kafze preserves bodies inside prepared context near a place people used. Sima preserves disarticulated remains far below the accessible surface of an ancient cave, after gravity and sediment erased their original positions. At Kafze, the grave itself demonstrates that someone arranged and covered a corpse. At Sima, the inferred human act occurred before the bodies reached the chamber. The missing threshold is precisely where the decisive behavior happened. Neanderthals, living tens of thousands of years after Kafze, add further comparisons at La Ferracie in France. Renewed study of a young child's remains and surrounding sediments concluded that a pit had been dug and the body placed within it. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a partly articulated adult discovered during modern excavations lay in a depression near earlier Neanderthal remains, supporting deliberate placement and repeated use of one area. The famous suggestion that flowers accompanied another Shanidar individual is much less secure. Pollen may have arrived through insects or natural processes. Intentional burial does not require that every decorative story attached to it be true. These later sites contain details absent at Sima articulation, grave-shaped depressions, and stratigraphic relationships showing that sediment was disturbed around particular bodies. Even then, individual cases remain disputed because natural hollows, rockfall, and incomplete early excavation records can imitate or obscure graves. Archaeologists do not recognize burial merely because a skeleton is complete. They ask whether a pit was cut, whether the body lay in a position unlikely to occur naturally, whether sediment was replaced, and whether scavengers had access before covering. Other sites warn that cutting a corpse cannot be assigned one universal meaning. Neanderthal bones at places such as Mula Gersi and Goyet show butchery, breakage, and in some cases human tooth marks consistent with cannibalism. Elsewhere, bodies may have been defleshed as part of a mortuary sequence without being eaten. The same stone edge can remove flesh for nutrition, dismember an enemy, clean the bones of a relative, or prepare remains for transport. Location, fracture patterns, skeletal representation, and associated refuse must carry the interpretation. Placed within this spectrum, Sima is exceptional but not a recognizable funeral in miniature. Its age of about 430,000 years makes it far older than the generally stronger grave evidence from later Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. Yet age does not permit the evidence to be promoted beyond what survives. The site may preserve the earliest known deliberate accumulation of human corpses. It cannot securely be called the earliest cemetery, burial ground, grave, or offering place. Comparison also removes one evolutionary shortcut. If Sima and Rising Star both involve deliberate corpse placement, the behavior appeared in populations separated by anatomy, geography, and evolutionary history. It may have emerged more than once from practical needs and social attention to dead group members. If only one case ultimately proves deliberate, the broader record still shows that mortuary behavior developed as a mosaic, rather than as a single invention owned by one species. The pit, therefore, marks a threshold, but not a spiritual one. Its inhabitants seem to have treated human bodies differently from butchered animals and ordinary refuse. That distinction required recognition, choice, and coordinated action. Whether it also required symbols, beliefs about unseen worlds, or concepts of persons surviving death is another question. The bones establish behavior more securely than thought, And the next challenge is to decide what kind of mind can reasonably be inferred from an act whose meaning has disappeared. The pit can demonstrate action more readily than belief. If people carried bodies to a shaft, remembered its location, and treated the dead differently from food refuse, they made social choices. But no fossil preserves the concept attached to them. A body may have been a person still owed attention, a source of decay, an object to hide from scavengers, or several of these at once. Before calling the act symbolic, we must separate the abilities required to perform it from meanings modern observers hope to find. At minimum, intentional placement would demand recognition of death, coordination, and planning. A heavy body could not be transported through uneven terrain casually. Group members had to decide where to move it, follow the route, and avoid the opening's dangers. If the practice was repeated, memory had to survive beyond the first event. None of this proves ritual. It reveals behavior organized around unresponsive members of a social group. The brains supporting that behavior survive only as negative impressions. Sediment filled parts of the skulls, creating natural and virtual endocasts that reproduce the cranial vault's internal surface. These forms can estimate size and reveal broad asymmetries, grooves, and vascular traces. They cannot preserve neurons, connections, or the operations from which thought emerges. An endocast is closer to a container's shape than to a recording of the mind inside it. The Sima sample is valuable because it includes 16 complete or partial endocasts from one population. Their volumes and organization show variation rather than one standardized pre-Neanderthal brain. 2 adult crania differ substantially in volume, reminding us that brain size varies with body size, development, and individual history. A larger brain does not directly measure intelligence, and a fossil average cannot rank a species' thoughts. Researchers examined frontal and occipital projections, or patalias, and the surface corresponding approximately to Broca's area. In living people, cerebral asymmetry often relates to language and skilled hand use. Sima includes similarities to living humans, but also individuals with little asymmetry and a group distribution unlike the strong modern tendency. Fossil landmarks cannot establish that a cortical circuit performed the same task as today. Broca's area does more than speech, which depends on networks beyond one visible region. Hand preference supplies another clue. Scratches on the front teeth were probably made when individuals held material between the teeth and cut it near the mouth. Their directions indicate that those studied generally controlled the tool with the right hand. Endocast comparisons agree for several individuals but not all. Learned technique, injury, ambidexterity, or uncertainty could separate habitual action from cranial form. Predominant right-handedness suggests motor lateralization. It is not a fossil sentence proving language. The throat preserves another part of communication. 2 Sima hyoid bones resemble those of living humans and Neanderthals. While differing clearly from chimpanzee and Australopithecus forms, the hyoid anchors tongue and laryngeal muscles, making it relevant to vocal production. Yet it is one component of a soft tissue system including the tongue, vocal folds, palate, nerves, breathing control, and larynx. Human-like shape makes articulate speech plausible. It reveals no vocabulary or grammar. Their ears add evidence from the receiving side. Reconstructions of several individuals produced a sound transmission pattern closer to living humans than chimpanzees, particularly in higher mid-range frequencies. This region carries spoken information, including consonant distinctions. Later comparisons found that Neanderthal auditory bandwidth was broader than Sima's and similar to living humans. The pattern was not static, but Sima ears were already suited to a wide range of socially useful sounds. Hearing capacity is not language. Many animals detect frequencies they never organize into syntax or stories. Language can also operate through gesture. Fossils address physical possibility, not linguistic structure. Surviving Sima DNA has not yielded a complete inventory of variants governing speech and cognition, and no single gene could settle the question. Genes such as FOXP2 participate in developmental networks. A particular version is not equivalent to modern language. Behavior nevertheless makes silence unlikely. Large game acquisition, resource transport, controlled stone flaking, teaching, and tolerance of impaired individuals all benefited from communication, calls, gesture, gaze, routines, and vocal sequences could combine flexibly. The question is not whether these people communicated, but how open-ended that system was. Archaeology cannot determine whether they discussed distant events, assigned names, or used recursive grammar. Excalibur is often asked to close this gap. If deliberately placed with the dead, an object may have represented more than its cutting edge. Unusual stone, careful shaping, and surrender of a useful implement could express association or obligation, but the chain remains conditional. The artifact may have been used, its surface was abraded, and its relationship to any body is unknown. Symbolic meaning cannot be recovered by repeating its modern nickname. The archaeological silence is uneven. Excalibur alone cannot represent the full technology of the population, because the chamber was not an occupation site, and almost none of their daily equipment entered it. Absence of ornaments, pigments, or engraved objects inside the pit therefore weighs less than it would at a settlement. Still, no securely associated evidence elsewhere identifies a Sima symbolic tradition. The correct conclusion is not that symbols were impossible, but that the surviving record has not demonstrated them. Even intentional disposal need not depend on symbols in a strict sense. A group can learn a rule through imitation when someone dies. Take the body here. A convention can persist because it works. Others expect it, or violation produces fear. Meaning may grow around repetition without leaving a marker. The distinction between practical and symbolic behavior may have blurred in life. The safest inference is layered. The Sima humans possessed large, variably organized brains, manual skill, human-like hyoids, and auditory capacities compatible with rich vocal communication. Their social world supported cooperation, learning, and responses to vulnerable or dead companions. If humans formed the accumulation, those capacities converged in a planned act. Unsupported are claims for fully modern language, funerary theology, or symbolism equivalent to that documented much later through ornaments, images, and unmistakable graves. This restraint does not make the population mentally empty. It protects their difference. They need not have thought exactly as we do for death to disrupt relationships, a remembered place to matter, or repeated action to carry weight. Their minds occupied an earlier point in branching human history, with familiar capacities perhaps organized in unfamiliar ways. Sima de los Huesos therefore offers no moment when consciousness crossed a line. It offers converging fragments, ears receiving detailed sound, throats capable of varied production, preferred hands, unevenly lateralized brains, and bodies possibly carried into darkness. Together they make complex communication and social memory plausible, without turning possibility into proof. The final task is to return to the chamber as a whole, and ask what it permanently changes about Neanderthals, human death, and the ancestry shared by populations once thought separate. The chamber does not surrender one clean answer. It preserves a population, a geological accident, and a possible human decision compressed into the same red clay. Around 430,000 years ago, bodies entered this part of the Atapuerca cave system. Gravity, water, animals, minerals, and sediment altered them. What excavation recovers is therefore neither an untouched scene of death nor a random collection of fossils. It is a damaged record whose patterns can change human history, but incomplete enough to resist a final verdict. The first transformation concerns ancestry. The Sima people once seemed convenient examples of Homo heidelbergensis, a broad label often placed between earlier Homo erectus and later Neanderthals or modern humans. Their anatomy made that simple arrangement difficult. Faces and teeth already display numerous Neanderthal-derived features, while other parts of the skull and body retain more ancestral forms. Nuclear DNA places them on the Neanderthal side of the later split from Denisovans, although their mitochondrial DNA followed a lineage more closely related to Denisovan mitochondria. They are not a perfect preview of one later species. They reveal evolution occurring as a mosaic within connected and changing populations. That conclusion moves the roots of Neanderthal history deeper than their most familiar fossils. Long before the classic Neanderthals of Ice Age Europe, selection and population history were already assembling the characteristic middle face, dentition, and other anatomical traits. Not everything changed at once. The Sima sample demonstrates why a species cannot be reconstructed from a single famous skull. Individuals varied in brain size, robusticity, pathology, age, and facial form while belonging to one closely related population. Its second transformation is numerical. More than 7,000 human fossils, representing at least 29 individuals, turn an evolutionary category into a population-level sample. Researchers can compare adolescents and adults, left and right sides, healthy joints and injured ones. Few sites offer this view so deep in time. The abundance does not make every inference certain, but it prevents one famous specimen from standing for an entire humanity. The bodies show lives shaped by strain rather than caricature. Teeth recorded food preparation and habitual actions. Hands suggest skilled manipulation and a strong tendency toward right-handed behavior. Bones preserve infections, developmental differences, healed injuries, and degeneration. These humans were physically powerful, yet none survived through strength alone. Young people learned techniques. Injured individuals continued living. Food and danger were managed socially. Cooperation is not an idealized moral portrait. It is the practical structure within which vulnerable bodies remained alive. Cranium 17 prevents that social world from becoming sentimental. 2 blows struck its forehead around the time of death, probably with the same or a similarly shaped blunt object. At least one person in this population died through interpersonal violence. The wounds do not reveal motive, attacker, or setting, and they cannot turn the entire deposit into evidence of massacre. They show only that conflict and cooperation belong to the same human landscape, as they have in every well-documented later society. The central mystery begins after death. Carnivores modified too few human bones to have assembled the population through feeding. Low-energy water deposited clay but did not sweep complete bodies from a distant surface. Ordinary occupation cannot explain a chamber almost devoid of tools, hearths, and food waste. Repeated accidental falls remain possible in principle, yet struggle to account economically for the concentration and skeletal representation. The leading interpretation is that humans introduce substantially complete corpses at an opening, after which gravity and natural processes carried and rearranged them below. Leading does not mean proven. The ancient entrance is missing. No body remains where it was first placed. No grave cut encloses an articulated skeleton, and available dating cannot tell whether the dead arrived together or across generations. The demographic profile can fit an unusual catastrophe, but it can also reflect selection, preservation, and a small sample. Human disposal explains the evidence well, while the exact sequence remains reconstructive rather than observed. Excalibur intensifies that uncertainty. The carefully shaped red quartzite handaxe is real, rare within the chamber, and technologically deliberate. Its symbolic role is not equally secure. It may have accompanied a corpse, marked collective act, entered with one episode of disposal, or simply fallen into the shaft. Calling it an offering makes an elegant story, but elegance cannot restore the lost association between object and hand. The tool remains a possibility made visible, not a message translated. For the same reason, the pit should not be announced as an established cemetery or humanity's first funeral. Deliberately moving the dead would itself be extraordinary at this age. It would imply recognition, planning, shared action, and perhaps memory of a particular place. None of those requirements automatically supplies belief in an afterlife, formal ritual, grief expressed as ours is, or fully developed symbolism. The evidence reaches an important threshold of behavior while stopping before theology. That boundary is one of Sima's greatest lessons. A human-like hyoid does not preserve speech. Auditory sensitivity does not prove grammar. A healed pathology does not record compassion. And a handaxe beside bones does not record prayer. Yet restraint does not reduce these people to instinctive shadows. Communication, learning, dependence, violence, memory, and some response to death remain grounded in evidence even when their inner meanings are inaccessible. What the pit permanently changes is the distance at which ancient humans appear recognizably social. More than 400 millennia ago, a population in Western Europe shared bodies, skills, risks, injuries, and perhaps a destination for its dead. These were close relatives on the early Neanderthal lineage, not failed versions of ourselves waiting to become modern. Their lives followed an evolutionary path that later disappeared, but many of the problems they faced dependence, conflict, bodily difference, and loss remain familiar. We end where the excavators began, above a narrow vertical descent into darkness. Below lies no preserved ceremony and no final confession from the dead. There are broken skulls, tiny ear bones, worn teeth, a pelvis, a wounded forehead, and one red stone tool. Together they say that something unusual happened. People may have carried their dead to this place long before any grave we can read clearly. Whether the act was practical, customary, emotional, symbolic, or all of these at once has vanished with the entrance through which the bodies came. Sima de los Huesos is powerful because it leaves that last space open. It gives us evidence of their ancestry without a simple species label, social life without a transcript, violence without a motive, and possible mortuary behavior without a surviving belief. The pit of bones does not tell us exactly what death meant to these humans. It reveals that death may already have required an answer, and that, 430,000 years later, we are still standing at the edge of their darkness, trying to understand what that answer was. Now let the questions settle. Leave the diagrams behind for a while, Imagine only the hill at evening, its slopes darkening beneath the sky of northern Spain. The caves are hidden inside limestone, their passages holding a silence older than every road, village, and field above them. Somewhere far below, beyond turns that no longer follow their ancient shape, lies the chamber we have called the Pit of Bones. Nothing moves there now except water arriving one drop at a time. It gathers on stone, slips over mineral surfaces, and disappears into clay. The sound is small. Calcite grows too slowly to watch. Sediment rests where gravity left it. The bones that once belonged to breathing bodies have become part of the earth around them. 430,000 years is almost impossible to hold in the mind. We can say the number, divide it, compare it with the length of recorded history, and still fail to feel its scale. Seasons passed over Atapuerca before any known city rose. Ice advanced and retreated. Forests spread, thinned, and returned. The chamber remained below, keeping what chance and human action had placed inside it. The people themselves did not experience deep time. Their lives unfolded in mornings and nights, hunger and rest, injuries and recovery. They knew the weight of stone in the hand, the calls of animals, and the familiar faces of those around them. They probably remembered paths, seasons, and dangers. Whatever words or gestures they used are gone, but their days were not abstractions. Each life was lived only once. Perhaps that is why the fragments affect us. A worn tooth is not merely a measurement. It marks years of eating and work. A healed injury marks time survived after pain. A tiny bone from the ear once carried vibrations toward a living brain. The broad pelvis, the strong limbs, and the faces reconstructed from pieces all belong to individuals who could not know that distant descendants would one day search for them in the clay. One skull carries the trace of 2 blows. One handaxe holds the color of red quartzite. Around them lie thousands of fragments without such memorable names. It is easy to let the violent skull and the solitary tool dominate the chamber, because stories gather around exceptional things. Yet most of the people in the pit remain quiet even by archaeological standards. Their importance comes from being there together. We do not know whether they entered the darkness after one catastrophe or across many returns. Imagine both possibilities without choosing between them. In one, a community faces several deaths at once and brings the bodies toward a known opening. In the other, the path is remembered over years, and the dead arrive one by one. Both scenes contain effort. Both require the living to respond to bodies that could no longer move themselves. Then release even those images. No torchlight remains on the wall. No footprints lead to the edge. No voice tells us whether the place inspired grief, fear, duty, or simple practicality. The ancient entrance has disappeared, and with it the moment from which every interpretation begins. We stand downstream from the act, surrounded by what geology allowed to survive. We do not need to turn these humans into modern mourners to recognize their social world. We do not need to deny them emotion because we cannot name it. The space between certainty and imagination can remain open. Within it, the evidence is allowed to be powerful without being forced to say more than it can. The same restraint belongs to their place in human ancestry. They were neither crude beginnings nor incomplete versions of people living today. They occupied their own present. Their anatomy carried traits that would become more pronounced in Neanderthals, while their genes preserved a history more tangled than a straight family tree. From within their lives, there were only other people, neighboring groups, familiar strangers, and perhaps encounters whose consequences no fossil can explain. Above the cave, evening would have arrived without ceremony. Light faded from the slopes, cold air gathered in low places. Animals moved through grass and woodland, leaving prints that the next rain might erase. Somewhere a group found shelter, shared food, tended a fire if fire was available to them, or rested close enough to hear one another breathing. Someone was absent. Whether that absence was spoken, feared, accepted, or carried in memory is beyond recovery. Below them, the chamber waited without knowing it was a chamber of history. Bodies decomposed, joints loosened, bones shifted slowly down the slope. Bears entered, and some never returned. Water brought clay. Minerals entered spaces and hardened. The original arrangement dissolved until no individual remained whole, yet the population survived in fragments. Much later, human beings entered again. This time they came with ropes, lamps, notebooks, containers, and questions. They crawled through narrow passages and descended the route, removing the deposit carefully enough to recognize teeth smaller than a fingernail. Year after year, fragments emerged, were cleaned, compared, scanned, fitted, and sometimes joined to pieces found far apart. The work transformed silence into evidence, but it did not end the mystery. Each answer revealed the edge of another unknown. That may be the most fitting way to leave Sima de los Huesos, not with a funeral reconstructed in perfect detail, and not with the cold conclusion that nothing can be known. Between those extremes lies a patient form of understanding. We can identify a population near the roots of the Neanderthal lineage. We can see injury, endurance, skill, and violence. We can judge deliberate body disposal more persuasive than many natural alternatives, and we can admit that motive remains out of reach. So let the red handaxe return to the clay. Let Cranium 17 rest among the other faces. Let the scientific labels fade until only the cave remains limestone. Darkness, water, and time. Far above, the night sky opens over Atapuerca, filled with stars whose light crosses distances that also resist imagination. The hill appears still, but nothing in its history was truly motionless. Landscapes changed, populations changed, bones became stone, and stone became testimony. The people in the pit vanished, yet traces of their bodies crossed an immense span to reach us. We cannot hear what they believed, but we can listen to the limits of what remains. And as the last light leaves the entrance, there is no need to solve the darkness. It is enough to know that deep below the sleeping hill, 29 ancient lives still gather in fragments. Their faces are incomplete. Their story is unfinished, for now. We leave them there, beneath the hill and stars. The chamber keeps the rest, quietly, while water falls through the long night, one drop at a time,